Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in. Hi. Okay. Here we go. My name is Veronica Angel, and I am a professor of risk and international politics and economics and European politics. And I am very, very happy to have the expert on the Western Balkans with us here today. Jelena Dzankic is a professor at the European University Institute, where she directs the Observatory for Southeast Europe. And she's also a co-director of the Global Citizenship Observatory. See, it's just a little bit outside my area, and then forget about it. She has not made a long trip from Florence, but I'm still really, really happy to have her here with us so we can discuss one of the most important regions in Europe right now, and what potential risks we will be dealing with in the coming years. So what we're going to do is allow Jelena to take over and present the things that she thinks are most important to look at for the coming years. And then we are going to go through a Q&A for about 30 minutes, for 1 hour, 45 minutes. And then you're all invited to aperitivo downstairs. There are the people who are online. Unfortunately, they can't join the aperitivo, but you can ask questions in the chat, and we will organize to answer for those as well. There is also a handmade, Michael, can you put it up? There's a handmade hat there where you can write your questions. If you have sometimes it's intimidating, to raise your hand and ask a question. So if you want to write an anonymous question within decency is important. I will then collect them and ask it for you. So Jelena, thank you so much for coming. I will start with a round of applause and take it over, and then we will grill you with some questions.
I think we could go straight to the aperitivo. What do you think? So thank you so much, Veronica, for the invitation. It's the first time for me here at Johns Hopkins, although I've lived in Italy for quite a while. My original idea was to start by doing a tour de table and essentially asking each and every one of you about who you were, what your interest in the Western Balkans would be. But I think if we start doing that, we could also go straight to the aperitivo without doing the talk of political risks, which actually wouldn't be that much of a bad thing. Less job for me. Anyways, Veronica has already introduced me. I'm a part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Center of the European University Institute, where I co-direct the Global Citizenship Observatory, and I run the program on Southeastern Europe. Now, I originally come from Montenegro, which is one of the countries in the Western Balkans, and this is the place where I was born. However, at the time of my birth, my parents had lived in Zenica, Bosnia and Herzegovina, because my dad was playing football. So what had happened was that my parents, right before the start of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, moved from Bosnia and Herzegovina back to Montenegro, but failed to register, meaning that for the next couple of years, I essentially lived the life of a de facto stateless person and had to naturalize to gain citizenship of Montenegro. Now, back in 1998, there was a political crisis in the then Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was composed at the time of Serbia and of Montenegro, obviously with Kosovo inside. And this crisis escalated because Slobodan Milosevic, the then president of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, started building up military troops on the borders of Kosovo and sending paramilitaries. And this is something that we'll see reflected even nowadays with the current Serbian leadership. Sending paramilitaries in the territory of Kosovo to assert its power and obviously to destabilize any, at that point, attempts to declare independence. In 1999, there was the NATO intervention in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is, in a way, which was for me personally the moment when I decided, okay, perhaps it's time to get a different perspective. And I decided to pursue my studies, so my bachelor's at the American University in Bulgaria, followed by a master's in democracy and human rights in Sarajevo. And the reason why I chose Sarajevo was precisely because I wanted to experience what the rebuilding of society, what the rebuilding of democratic institutions after war would essentially look like, followed by some additional studies in the UK and a PhD at the University of Cambridge, after which I came back to Italy, to the European University Institute, primarily to study citizenship in contested states, which is in a way something that has been defined through my personal story, through my personal trajectory, because each of the movements that I have made have been marked by this, in a way, if you wish, living in a circumstance that's been produced by broader political developments and political decisions throughout the 90s. So this was just as a sort of a teaser to tell you a little bit about me, and obviously to tell you a little bit about the perspective from which I view the events in the Western Balkans. Now here, the talk today is, see if this works, is on the political risks in the region. And I wanted to start, and I've essentially wanted to start, again, with a couple of stories. So here you can see on the screen a couple of shots from a recent CNN interview done by, actually two interviews, done by Christiane Amanpour, one with the president of Kosovo, Vjosa Osmani, and the other one with Aleksandar Vučić, who is currently the president of Serbia. And essentially the motivation for these interviews is the current crisis between Serbia and Kosovo, which is seriously destabilizing the Western Balkan region. So on the 24th of September, Serb paramilitaries ambushed a police patrol in northern Kosovo, killing one police officer. What happened then was that the gunmen fled to a monastery near the border between Serbia and Kosovo, where the Kosovan police engaged in, let's say, in a shooting and essentially killed 3 armed Serbs, while the rest of them essentially were able to fled back to Serbia. What followed was ping pong, sort of a blame shifting game. So I don't know if any of you has had the opportunity to watch the Oscar-winning movie from Bosnia and Herzegovina, No Man's Land, where the two key protagonists just keep blaming one another on who started the war. So this kind of blame shifting has happened in the case between Serbia and Kosovo right after this incident. On the 29th of September, so 5 days later, the Serbian authorities have started to amass their armed troops very close to the border of Kosovo. And this essentially created a security situation which required an intervention of outside forces. Only after a phone call with the US President, Joe Biden, did the Serbian President, Aleksandar Vučić, decide to withdraw a part of the troops from the north of Kosovo. So what we could see here is how a situation, how tensions that have been unresolved for the last, if you wish, 30 years, but we could go even further back in history, can escalate in an unstable environment. Now, in this particular moment, the armed conflict has been avoided, so for now. But we have 3 important takeaways from this situation. One is that regional stability in the Western Balkans is very fragile, and there can be a lot of disturbances of it by all sorts of different events and issues, and we can talk about this later on and also in the Q&A session. Second, how to use war to distract from domestic problems. And this is something that's obviously happening in the case of Serbia. So earlier on this year, in Serbia, there have been 2 mass shootings, one of which in an elementary school and another one in a provincial town in central Serbia. And this was followed by mass protests in Belgrade. So political analysts are claiming that Vučić is using this opportunity to create a crisis with Kosovo in order to avoid issues domestic. And the third takeaway from this circumstance is that the negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, in the context of both of these countries want to be EU member states. And in order to become EU member states, they need to resolve their issues. So negotiations between them have been ongoing for the last 6-7 years. And this situation has broken the momentum to achieve any progress in resolving the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo, obviously then preventing the countries to advance in their aspiration to join the European Union. Now, the second teaser is a lot of priests. So this is an image from the 2020 protests in Montenegro. And these protests, as you can see, were not civic protests. They were protests that were sparked by the adoption in December 2019 of a law on religious freedoms. And this law was adopted by the long ruling party, the Democratic Party of Socialists, and it had a particular clause. It wasn't a law only on religious freedom, but law that essentially dealt with property. So one of the articles of that law stipulated that the property of churches that were built before 1918, which was the year of Montenegrin unification with Serbia, would pass on to the state. Now, the religious community that would be most affected by this move was the Serbian Orthodox Church. Now, in the Orthodox world, churches are unlike in the Catholic countries, churches are national, meaning that each sovereign state is allowed to have its own church. So there have been, for the last 30 years, these discords between the Serbian Orthodox Church not recognizing the Montenegrin Orthodox Church. So essentially, there was this contestation over who should also claim the monasteries, the property of churches, and which church should be the national church in Montenegro. Now, the adoption of this law was followed by several months of protests, which were led and incited by religious authorities. So eventually, these protests, which had a religious basis, but drew in quite a lot of people, brought the end of the DPS rule in Montenegro and also caused a lot of societal instability. And this is an example of how, in a way, reconstituting the questions of constituting and reconstituting the people and the questions that have to deal with religion rather than with civic culture can destabilize political institutions in the Western Balkans. The third image that you see here as a teaser is essentially related to, let's say in this specific case, the Chinese investments in the Western Balkans. And we'll talk more about this towards the end of my talk, but the amount of investments of China in the region has grown exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years. Chinese had financed, amongst other things, the mining industry in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia. They financed or purchased the shares, 100% of shares of the Tirana airport. which I'll see in 2 weeks. So ask me after that. But also the motorway in Montenegro, which might have important consequences on the country's economy. What I want to say is that not only the Chinese investments, but also creating all sorts of economic dependencies on these external factors is something that can deeply destabilize democratic development in the Western Balkans. And now, after this lovely trailer of the talks, let's go back to what the talk is essentially about. So before going on to discuss the different types of political risks of which these stories were essentially an illustration, just wanted to briefly focus on the notion of political risk, which is a concept that's been borrowed from political economy. And here you see a 2011 definition referring to the risks faced by investors, corporations, governments, where political decisions, events, or other conditions can significantly affect the profits of a business sector. It's a boring definition for political scientists, which is why we can essentially adapt it to understanding political developments from the lenses of political science and IR. And political risks in this case can essentially be translated into risks to security, stability, or democratic development of countries and territories caused by political decisions, caused by externalities, or some other sorts of predicaments that affect the well-being of the population. Now, this is the definition that we operate with for the purposes of our talk today, and I'm happy to perhaps in the Q&A explain how it has been constructed. And just to, as a footnote, today we'll talk about the Western Balkans. And I was at the talk last week where the speaker was explaining the difference between Southeastern Europe and the Western Balkans, whereas the concept of Southeastern Europe is primarily geographical, whereas the notion of the Western Balkans is essentially a political concept. It has been developed in the late 1990s when the European Union started its stabilization and association process with the region. And essentially, it's been developed to refer to the EU's southern neighbors who essentially wanted to become EU's member states. So at the time when this definition was first coined, if you wish, it included ex-Yugoslavia minus Slovenia plus Albania. And at that time, these countries also included Croatia. Croatia entered the European Union in 2013. And it is very funny because if you go on the website of the European Commission, where they talk about the Western Balkans, they'll give you the old definition, including Croatia, and then they'll say, in 2013, Croatia became an EU member state. But nowhere would they list, again, which countries are now considered to fall into the Western Balkans. I normally refer to those countries that are not in the EU, so Croatia can self-identify as an EU member state. Now, political risks. There can be different types of political risks. What I want to focus on during the rest of the talk today are three types of political risks and what kinds of outcome they can essentially have. And you can say, well, but these are in a way risks themselves. But yet I think that these are structural conditions that enhance the risks that can occur in unstable political and geographic context. So today I'll talk about the risk of contested states. And these are countries that are territorially contested in the context of their borders by either an internal group seeking to secede or an external country contesting borders or contesting shares of the population. And these contested states have as their consequence political instability, and we'll see how this happens through a couple of examples, and can ultimately lead to conflict or high propensity for conflict, as is the case currently between Serbia and Kosovo, but there are also other zones in the Western Balkans that are more prone to escalation of conflict, and we can talk about this. The second political risk is the lack of democratic culture. We'll see in a bit more detail, because this is a very subtle political risk, but it is very much present in countries that have come out of socialism, and instead of going on a democratic route, what has happened was that these countries either descended into war or international isolation, and never properly managed to develop a democratic culture, a culture of participation, and a culture in which politicians are essentially accountable to the people for their decisions. The outcomes of this are state capture, meaning politicians essentially take over the state and manage it as their private business, but also in its extreme, the lack of democratic culture leads to democratic backsliding and slipping into autocracy. The third kind of a risk is the one that we've mentioned in the last slide with the pictures. These are the dependencies on external actors, and these dependencies can be different. I've mentioned the case of Chinese economic investments, but dependencies can also be political. They can be religious, or they can be cultural. And these dependencies essentially can, in some cases, lead to financial problems, but also to radicalization, especially if they're accompanied by high influence over the media or over the cultural sphere in the countries of the Western Balkans. Now, just gonna go through this, and perhaps we can talk about examples or some issues in the Q&A session. Now, if you think about the 6 Western Balkan countries, all bar Albania, meaning all the states that come out of the former Yugoslavia, are contested states. And they are contested either domestically or externally or both. In most cases, they're contested at both levels. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the contestation stems from the 3 constituent communities, because Bosnia is created as a federal state composed of 2 entities and 3 constituent peoples. And these tensions between these 3 constituent peoples not willing to relinquish their power essentially do not allow political reforms to take place. Just to give you an example, and I'll come to the details in a minute, the country has been unable to implement constitutional reform to give political rights to minorities since 2009. It's been quite a while since this has been also recognized as a requirement for the country to democratize and progress in its ambition to join the European Union. The case of Kosovo, we've seen it's very much contested also domestically. The northern part of Kosovo is inhabited by the Serbian community, and there are very frequently clashes between the population of Kosovo identifying as Kosovan or Albanian and the population in North Kosovo, which identifies with Serbia and essentially aligns quite a lot with the politics of the Serbian government. In North Macedonia, the domestic contestation also comes from the different communities constituting the country, meaning Macedonians, but also Albanians and Turks, always seeking to find a balance of rights and obligations in the country. And Serbia is contested in itself. So if you ask the Serbian government or authorities, they would see the issue of Kosovo as a domestic issue, whereas anyone recognizing the independence of Kosovo would see it as an extra element of external contestation. External contestation, quickly, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, comes from the kin states of the constituent peoples, meaning Croatia and Serbia for the Croatian and Serbian population. of the country. In Montenegro, we've talked a little bit about the challenges through the church. So there are elements of Montenegrin identity challenged by Serbia. In the case of North Macedonia, and this is interesting for those of you who are doing EU studies, North Macedonia at the time when it seceded from Yugoslavia at the time, named itself constitutionally as the Republic of Macedonia. However, Greece, which hosts the historical region of Macedonia, objected to the use of the name the Republic of Macedonia by Macedonia. So essentially for some 25 years, or even a little bit more, the country was internationally called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which also indicates this external contestation by Greece, which was then blocking North Macedonian entry into the EU and NATO, etc., etc. Eventually, the country changed its name to North Macedonia to unblock its issues with Greece, but then there currently is a little bit of an issue with its other neighbor Bulgaria, which contests the language and culture of North Macedonia, again blocking its entry or progress on the EU accession course. Obviously, in all of these cases, and you can see both of them just running on the slide, you have the combination of domestic and external contestation of states. So, where does that lead us and where does that lead us? Leads us to political deadlocks. So I've mentioned the reform blockages in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina is particular. It was adopted as a part of a peace agreement. So the Dayton Peace Agreement, Annex 4, contains the constitution of BNH. This constitution foresees a power sharing, as I mentioned, amongst the three constituent peoples. And there are positions to which you can be elected if and only if you're a Serb, you're a Bosniak, or you're a Croat. Meaning if you're a Roma, or if you're a Jew, or if you're any other minority, you can't be elected to the House of Peoples, you can't be elected to the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, in the mid-2000s, Jewish man, Jakub Sejdić, and a Roma person, Dervo Finci, essentially put forward their cases to the European Court of Human Rights, which decided then on the famous case Sejdić and Finci versus Bosnia and Herzegovina, that the Bosnian constitution violates their human rights, and invited the country to change its constitution in its 2009 ruling. This has not happened so far. So it's been quite a while since 2009, because none of the constituent peoples essentially wants to relinquish power and give an extra seat to the country's minorities. Now, political deadlocks can also result from external contestation, and I've just mentioned the case of North Macedonia not being able to progress in its European Union accession route. And just as a footnote, North Macedonia was essentially the first from among the former Yugoslav countries to start the stabilization and association process in 2004, and Croatia followed the year after in 2005. And as a result of these external contestations and blockages, the country has only recently received or opened the accession negotiations. The second outcome is political instability. Again, this can result from the domestic contestation, and the examples here are Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. In Montenegro, currently there are issues in constituting the the new government, and the previous one has lasted only for a while. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are also frequent protests and dissatisfaction with the government, leading to all sorts of internal blockages. And obviously political instability, this time in the case of Kosovo as a result of Serbia's contestation of its independence. When the lines between domestic and external contestation are blurred, meaning when a country believes that a territory can't secede or that the territory should remain within its boundaries, borders, as is the case of Kosovo, but also to a certain degree with the Republika Srpska, there is high propensity for conflict. And I think the Western Balkans essentially show how this can happen in various places. Now, the second political risk, and I think I should speed up, just warn me of the time because I tend to just take a little bit longer. The second risk or key risk in the Western Balkans is the lack of a democratic culture. These countries have very scarce experience with democracy. And as I mentioned before, after they came out from communism, from socialism, unlike countries in Central and Eastern Europe, so unlike the Czech Republic or unlike Hungary, well, at that time, let's not talk about Hungary today, at that time, they essentially, Central and Eastern Europe had this dream of democracy. They had this dream of the return to Europe. So they did what they, well, there was a dream. Come on, they had the dream of returning to Europe, and they moved towards it. So they embarked on a democratic the path from the fall of socialism for the former Yugoslav countries, but also to a large degree with Albania after the fall of the Berlin Wall was downwards. So the former Yugoslav lands descended into wars. Albania went into an even greater isolationism, which did not allow for this political moment of the rebirth of democracy, or at least an attempted birth. Veronica, I see you making faces, to take foot in the Western Balkans. After the 90s, these countries were left with the legacies of the war. And rebuilding post-conflict societies is a little bit difficult, because one thing that people often overlook is transitional justice, and essentially how to overcome divisions that have happened at the societal level between neighbors who used to be neighbors and friends and then went to war, and how to rebuild those, the societal tissue that connects. And obviously, there's a low understanding of political participation. Quite a few people in the Western Balkans essentially trust in political institutions. And the reason why they don't trust in political institutions is that they don't see their own stakes. They don't see that they can change anything with their votes. So this kind of a failure to understand that politicians essentially should be accountable to them is something that poses an important political risk when translated into political institutions. And obviously, these countries, as I mentioned, have fallen into a sort of a transition black hole. So there's a cycle of societal negativity. So things have not developed in a good way. My voice doesn't mean anything. So what am I going to do? I don't go and vote because I simply don't care. Or I'm going to get out of here and just go and work in Germany and try to construct a better life for myself and for my family. So one of the things that you can see is a high degree of emigration from the Western Balkans, which has increased over the last 2 years to 25% of Montenegrin population, which has emigrated, up to 50% of the population of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which now lives abroad. And the numbers in North Macedonia, Serbia, and Albania are around between 30 and 40%. So you can see a huge number of people simply leaving these countries in pursuit of better opportunities elsewhere. And where does this lead to? State capture. Low accountability of political leadership simply enables them to, again, run the state and state bureaucracies as their own company. And this has happened during privatization. So what has been done in most cases in the Western Balkans? The decision makers had decided to issue these privatization mass voucher. They've done the mass voucher privatization and issued vouchers for companies to the company workers. They've then devalued those vouchers and enabled their, let's say, political associates to purchase vouchers from the company's workers to then invest in companies which would become then their ownership. And this is how they essentially captured the key important points in a lot of states in North Macedonia, especially during the first rule of the Social Democrats, but also in Montenegro during the 30 years of the DPS. Lack of a democratic culture leads us to populism, and very recently that's one of my favorite examples. The Serbian President Vučić has announced that they will decrease the prices of quite a lot of products that are used by low-income families. So bread and ham and certain types of cheese. And then you would see him on national television sitting down with the minister of, I don't know which minister it was, and eating one of those sandwiches made out of that bread and that ham and saying to people, look, we're just like you. We love eating these kinds of sandwiches. And I'm sorry that I couldn't find the clip because it would have been super funny to show. And a very similar thing has happened in Montenegro, where the Europe Now movement, but that was also the practice of the DPS, would simply just increase pensions ahead of elections or give some benefits to those who would essentially be able to vote. In North Macedonia, there has been a whole project, and if you wish, we can talk about this even during the aperitivo, of reconstructing the city of Skopje as a way of reconstructing the identity of Macedonia. So the whole city was rebuilt in this very, they call it neo-Baroque style, representing the heroes, representing some very questionable historical figures who have essentially who have been designated to represent the people in that case, or the policies of Edi Rama targeting the local population, such as repainting the buildings in the city of Tirana to make people happier, because Tirana during transition was a very gray city and Edi Rama was an artist, so he said, let's paint the facades in different colors, it will make people happier. And these kinds of things can ultimately lead to the rise of autocracy, and this is something that we can see in all 6 of the Western Balkan countries, and something that has taken momentum over the past couple of years. And now finally, dependencies on external actors. As I mentioned briefly before, we can see different types of influence that's exercised by non-democratic foreign actors. And now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing only on the, let's say, non-democratic foreign actors. The first one is economic. And this refers to the investments in the Western Balkan countries, primarily by China, but also increasingly by the Gulf states and by Russia. And what I find incredibly interesting is that they're sectorally segmented. So you'll see most Chinese investments in, let's say, heavy industry, in mining, in also to a certain degree road construction, infrastructural projects. If you think about the Gulf states, most of their investments are in the service industry. So you'll see a lot of hotels, resorts, etc., etc., and you'll see quite a lot of Russian investment in real estate, which in a way has different consequences also on these countries' economies. Political influence, mainly by Russia, and this is something that you can see through bilateral meetings at the high level, but also political decisions that are taken by leadership of different Western Balkan countries. Cultural and religious influence, mainly by Turkey and Russia, building on trajectories of historical influence of these countries in the Western Balkan region. Now, where does this lead us? Economic dependencies can essentially have consequences from environmental damage, and perhaps the most illustrative one is the one in the Serbian town of Bor, where the Zin Mining Group, which has acquired the copper mine in the city of Bor, and it's a Chinese company, has essentially polluted the river pack through poor wastewater management. So this is something that has happened, but not only in Serbia, also in other places. Two possible bankruptcy. Montenegro at one point decided to build this highway. And if you want to see this, there's a really nice movie done by the Bertelsmann Stiftung. It's called Tinderbox, Belt and Road, speaking about Chinese influence in the Western Balkans in a very interesting way. So what has happened is that Montenegro wanted to build this highway, but didn't have money. Then it went to different European countries and they asked for a loan, but the European countries said, no, guys, this is way too expensive and too risky for us. So what did the Montenegrin government at the time do? They went to the Chinese Exim Bank, which gave them $1 billion, which at the time was a little bit weaker. So with the strengthening of the US dollar, the loan essentially increased, and Montenegro is struggling to repay this Chinese loan. So essentially in the mid to long term, it might have serious consequences for the country, potentially also bankruptcy, but let's stay positive. Political dependencies. Obviously, the most illustrative case there is the democratization and misalignment with Euro-Atlantic foreign policy trajectory. And this is something that you can see when countries such as Serbia do not align with European foreign policy, with sanctions on Russia or other countries. Cultural dependencies can, in their extreme, lead to radicalization. And this is something that can happen especially when there is a lot of foreign influence through media and disinformation campaigns. And I think right now, in the case of the Western Balkans, this cultural dependencies, especially on Russia, and there are a lot of Russian disinformation campaigns, especially between Serbia and Kosovo, can lead to radicalization of society. So, just to briefly conclude, we see these three main categories, if you wish, of political risks in the Western Balkan countries. And they have an important propensity to escalate, but the degrees of this escalation will have different political and social outcomes. And obviously these will differ from one country to another. The consequences, deterring them from the democratic path, domestic destabilization, and making these countries vulnerable to external threats. Now, what I wanted to end with is essentially a question for you as people who look at risks, who have some knowledge of the Western Balkans, is whether you see, how do you see this region? Do you see it as a region of high risk for European peace and security, or do you see it as something that's not important? What is it that makes this region worthy considering in the context of risks? So I'll leave it there, and then I'll sit down and we can talk.
So that was excellent, so very concise, so many countries to deal with at the same time, and rifts within them as well. And as I was reading, and please prepare your questions, as I was listening to you, I was thinking that this is a lesson. There are so many lessons to learn from the Western Balkans that we can apply in so many other places, not least in the European Union's eastern border. But also if you look into Central Asia and other regions of the world as well. So if I were to answer that question, absolutely, this is a high risk area. And my first question for you would be also related to the impact of other types of actors, right? So you have spoken so eloquently about the influence of the bad actors or the external influences of the non-democratic foreign actors, but how about the democratic actors? And particularly in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, the European Union has again unleashed its, I call it the diplomacy of broken promises, and reopened this conversation about enlargement and so on. And from what you're saying, and from what we've known about the region as well, the countries are not very close to achieving these sort of dreams. So I'm wondering, what is the effect? What is your prediction, if you so put it, on for the future of these countries? What is the effect of these renewed promises that you too can be Romania and Bulgaria, which is dysfunctional, but within the European Union?
Now you're asking me $1 million question. So the democratic actors have, in a way, over the last 20 years, both the EU and the US, if you wish, as the key democratizing factors, have in a way left the Western Balkans outside of their primary sphere of interest. And one of the results of this was essentially opening up of the space for these other non-democratic actors to, let's say, take up some of the societal, political, and economic, make up some of the societal, political, and economic leverage in the Western Balkans. Now, with Russian aggression on Ukraine, the EU has renewed its promise that the Western Balkan countries have a future in the European Union. This is a promise that has been given to these countries back in 2003. Since then, as we know, only Croatia has become a new EU member state. Where this new promise will lead is something that the two of us have written about, Veronica, so you shouldn't be asking me this question, because essentially there's a discrepancy between the rhetoric on EU enlargement and the reality of this process. What is unlikely to happen in the near future, in my own opinion, is EU membership for these countries. A, because the EU is not ready for that, and B, because these countries are not ready for it. Meaning that a prolonged process might open up further political risks for the region. And I think that this is something that we're starting to see with growing instability, especially over the last year and a half.
Fake news. Okay, so we.
Hi, my question is related to about join European Union. Can you hear me? Okay, so as you said, they are motivated to join European Union. And do you think with the conflict between Kosovo and Serbia, like they will try to resolve it being motivated to join European Union, or do you believe it's gonna escalate?
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm in the MAIR program. My question was related to Chinese and Russian investments. So could you speak more about the domestic perspectives or attitudes of citizens towards these investments, and maybe how that has changed their perspective on possibly joining the EU, or yes, or like their perspectives towards their local governments as well? Thank you.
Tito Cordera, just a quick question, just out of curiosity. What allowed Croatia to detach itself from the curse of the Western Balkans?
These are all excellent questions. Now, to the first one, I didn't catch your name, Sham. Essentially, Kosovo and Serbia, if the ultimate desire of these countries is to join the European Union, they will have to renew the platform for political dialogue. And there is this platform for political dialogue within the European Union structures. There's the special representative for the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo, and the countries were negotiating. However, and this is my personal opinion, as a result, to a large degree, of the domestic problems in Serbia, Vucic is escalating the question of Kosovo, thus acting towards destabilizing the region. Again, there are elements and political actors in these countries who declaratively support EU accession. However, when it comes to things you need to do in order to become an EU member state, they are not willing to bear the political costs. So there is something that you could term as political commitment rhetorically, but when it comes to actually bearing political costs, that's something that they're, I believe, unwilling to do. But I sincerely hope that they'll go back to actually negotiating instead of further escalating the conflict. To Sophia, another super interesting and excellent question on how the Chinese and Russian investment affects the local people. And I'd really recommend that you watch the movie, because they've also interviewed some people living in the areas where these mines have been constructed. And especially with industrial investments, the effects of pollution have been felt by local population. But then we get to the second risk that I've mentioned. Local population does not hold their politicians accountable. So it's a rather complicated situation. And it's very similar with, say, the Russian investments in real estate. There are areas of Montenegro with high concentration, especially in the coastline, of people, of Russians who have purchased houses there. The local population is dissatisfied, and this is something that they'll tell you because the prices of real estate have gone up, but they will not hold their local politicians accountable for it. So there's this passivity. When it comes to perspectives on joining the European Union, from the local point of view, the two things are disconnected, again, as a result of the lack of democratic political culture. But if you think about political decisions that policymakers will have to take if they want to enter the European Union, at some point they will have to bear the political cost of detaching or, in a way, dealing with the consequences of these bad investments. Because if you're to align with the EU's environmental policy, you can't have a polluted river, or you can't have tires dumped on top of a mountain. These are simply things that will have to be resolved. To Tito, what allowed Croatia to escape the Western Balkan curse? I think if people knew it, they would essentially just follow suit. Jokes aside, I think that political leadership of Croatia at the moment of democratization in the early 2000s essentially committed, not only rhetorically, but also in terms of political costs. And what they have done, and I think this was very much valued in the context of EU accession, they have dealt with problems of corruption, also holding some high-level politicians accountable for, let's say, conflict of interest, for corruption, etc. They have committed to a large degree to processing people who had participated in wars, and they were not as contested, which I think may be the main thing, as the rest of the Western Balkan countries. So I think that these would be the key elements.
All right, so shall we go to another round? I think this was the first question here. And then...
Hi, Daria. Thank you so much. So I was recently at a conference about geopolitical rivalry in the West Balkan states in Berlin, and they was talking mainly about exactly what you're talking about, foreign investment, but also political influence. And then the discussion really quickly ended up about natural resources in the West Balkan. And I was wondering, in your opinion, how much of a risk factor is, I think it was cobalt, I'm not sure, are the natural resources that the West Balkans have?
My question follows up on Veronica's question. So Veronica asked about the political presence of democratic countries, and I wanted to know what are the trade links and economic links, foreign direct investment links between these countries and the Western economies, and whether you think that that can exacerbate this political risk, or do you think that it will have a positive impact? And related to that, does the migrants diaspora play any role in terms of this political risk? Again, the people who leave, especially those who go to countries, democratic institutions campaign for go back at home. There is evidence from the literature that has happened in other contexts, and I was wondering whether that is happening in the region.
Hi, my name is Hannah. Thank you so much for interesting remarks. I was just wondering if we're going to try to maybe learn some lessons from our past mistakes, speaking about the EU's enlargement policy towards the Western Balkans. What's the one thing we should have done differently? What's the one thing that we should change if we're looking towards the future? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mathieu Le Breton. I'm in the MAIR program. My question is just a small one related to the interests of the Gulf states in the region. I get why China would want to expand influence there through debt trapping, why Russia would want to preserve or recoup influence, but I'm just interested, this might be related to the resources question that was asked, what the Gulf interests are in the region.
I would also like to mention that the Tinderbox movie is made by a SAIS alumnus. So yes, it was presented here last year, and we're very proud.
Yeah, and I think if you contact Sam, that he'll be happy to share the link if it's not available online already. Now, I think the question of natural resources is a very interesting one. I'm going to be completely honest with you and tell you I'm not an expert on the topic. In the Balkans, indeed, there are quite a lot of natural resources, and especially coal and mining in the areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and the south of Serbia, where if you start to think about it, there's also often quite a lot of contestation. What I think has happened over the past 10 years, again, as a non-specialist expert, has been this depletion of these resources through, in most cases, inadequate extraction. So there have been river canyons that have been damaged. There have been dumping sites for all sorts of products that come or kind of to get as leftovers after mining, and essentially quite a lot of these natural resources have been depleted over the years. So I think that that's going to be an important issue also in the context of EU accession, and also in the context of these countries moving forward. Now, on the economic links with Western economies, there is a really important paper by Milica Ubalic and Matteo Bonomi, and they essentially look at the percentage of trade between the Western Balkans and the European Union countries, and the Western Balkans, the US, and also with China and Russia. And there's a huge percentage, or actually trade relations with the European Union member states are super important. They actually have the highest percentage in most of the Western Balkan countries. Now, I think that these, it's kind of, if you think about it from the EU lenses, these are small countries and small economies. And trade with them is, in a way, second-grade trade if you compare it to trading with larger economies such as Ukraine or such as the US. But if you look at it from the Western Balkan states, it might provide an incentive for creating more stable economic conditions for future trade relationships with the EU. And the question of migrant diaspora, that's a super interesting one, because I think that it depends on the nature of the diaspora. So the immigrants from the Western Balkans who have settled in, quite a lot of them in Germany, but also in the US, and it's kind of very recently, quite a lot of medical doctors have moved to Scandinavian countries. They send remittances to their families, etc., and a huge percentage, so somewhere around 17 to 20% of certain countries' GDPs is constituted through remittances, right? Meaning that the diaspora has an important say in, or could potentially have an important say. But the issue is different diasporas located in different places are different. And diasporas sometimes can be more nationalistic than the domestic population. And here, I have had some. I've had the chance to see how the different diaspora circles in Germany operate, and sometimes they would, in a way, propagate the narratives of the 1990s, despite the fact that they live in a Western European state. So when they think of their home country, they become nationalistic, and it's also something that Benedict Anderson talked about when he talked about long distance nationalism. Now, to Hannah, what the EU should have done differently. Ooh, that's, yeah. But yeah, that's a long project. Put me in the head. Yeah. I think the key perhaps failure, but then it was a sort of a chain reaction. I think the key failure of the European Union was in dealing with the crisis of Yugoslav breakup in the early 1990s. Because I think at that point, a more substantive intervention or engagement by the EU could have changed events. But it's, in a way, it's difficult. And I think that this is perhaps for the EU a lesson learned, because the EU reacted quite quickly in the case of Ukraine. So if come on, it's the EU. You can't expect them to, it's kind of, they're doing what they can with what they've got. So, but essentially it is far more engaged in conflict resolution than what it used to be in the 1990s. And to Mathieu, if I'm not mistaken, the Gulf states. Now, after the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, quite a lot of Gulf states started to build up their presence through donations for building mosques, religious centers, etc., in that particular region. Now, over the years, these investments have, especially in the coastal areas, become mostly, as I mentioned, in the service industry. So you'll see these Dubai resorts, etc., and you will see quite a lot of interactions also at the political level. Now, where these deals are made, it's sometimes not fully in the open. Yeah.
Right. Another round.
Yeah.
There's a question here, and then I think there are two at the back, and we also have two questions online. From Manon. May I say, so the role of young people in the build-up of democratic culture, and also whether you see any role for the EPC, the European Political Community, that has just met in Granada, and they don't seem to have achieved much, if you ask me. But no, they didn't ask me, they asked you. So your opinion on this? Yes, go.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. My name's Robert. I'm a first-year MA/IR student. I was wondering, in terms of the role the U.S. plays in the region, you mentioned that in September, when the situation escalated regarding Kosovo and Serbia, President Biden spoke to the Serbia's president, and that helped de-escalate the situation. I was curious, how large of a risk is the upcoming U.S. presidential election in terms of potentially destabilizing the region? Should there be a change in the administration? Thanks.
Hi, I'm John. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about paramilitaries in Serbia. To what extent are these independent actors, or are they extensions of the state? And also, are there similar groups operating in other parts of the Balkans.
And one more, if there's anyone, I want to exercise illegal affirmative action. If everyone identifies as Western Balkan, Eastern Balkan, you get a question. No? All right. Yes, I saw a gasp there. No. Yes, one more question here.
Hi, my name is Junyi. I'm a second-year MAIA student. I guess I'm interested to know, before you mentioned the non-democratic foreign actors came in and invested in infrastructure, coal mining, real estate. Before they came in, what kind of investment or, say, economic relationship did the region establish with external factors? And if they were such problems, why weren't they managed through political influence or anything?
Sorry, I didn't switch this on. On the role of young people, I think that it's, as the young people themselves would say, it's complicated. Quite a lot of, and an increasing percentage of young people from the region want actually to leave. And this is the trend, particularly due to this disillusionment with democracy, with the fact that they will join the EU, etc., etc. But I think that if with proper, and this might sound a little bit idealistic, I think that with proper education, with proper knowledge, it's the young people who could carry these countries forward if they don't leave. Now, the EPC role, Veronica has kindly answered the question. I don't see it as an important for anything related to the EU accession of the Balkans. And it's also a story that has been attempted before. It's a story that has not succeeded. And I think the EPC itself would need to better understand its role, A, in the context of a broader European cooperation, and B, in the context, and this is something that should be thought through at the level between EPC and the EU, where one ends and the other starts, and where the roles of the two are. To Robert, on the role of the US and the risks related to the upcoming US elections, that's an incredibly good question. And I think the US has been a very important player and highly influential in the context of the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s. And that means that whoever is in power in the United States will have the possibility to shape the region's future. And I think that it will depend on who this person is and what their political course is. Let's call it like this. Now, on the paramilitaries in Serbia and groups operating in other countries, I think that this culture of paramilitaries is something that you can find mostly in territories in the Western Balkans where you actually had proper war. So these would be mostly Serbia, Kosovo, and bits of possibly nowadays less of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now it's horribly difficult to study these paramilitary groups and their connections to the official authorities. Well, it's difficult to prove the connection in many cases, but I believe that their very existence says a lot about how they operate, and the operations, the actions that they take also say a lot in themselves as to who they're connected to and what their objectives essentially are. Now, as to the non-democratic actors and the kinds of economic relations that the region had with foreign actors in general beforehand, this is a super interesting question because it also, you made me think about the structure of relationships of these countries with other Eastern but also Western partners during communism, and then in the post-communist period, because you could see real investments from both Western and Eastern countries in the Western Balkans only when privatization happened, and this was in and around the 2000s, and when the markets were open to these kinds of things. So I think that what was there before were probably some ad hoc economic relations, but not essentially investment, because communist countries were very particular in that regard, and it wasn't an investment-based economy. So I think I'll leave it at that if there are any questions.
Communist countries were very selective about one last question. No, two. Read the question. Okay, can I will see it first, but first can we have a question here and I'll read the other one. All right, Lawyer Slovenia as a successful.
Hello, I'm Alessandra. I'm a European public policy student, and I was wondering if you could give us some most likely scenarios and your personal forecast on the region in the following years. I don't know, the time frame is up to you, 5 years, whatever. Thank you.
And your predictions about the future. Of course, about your predictions.
Okay. So to Nika, and thank you for your question. I think, well, Slovenia is the region that the country in the region that others in a way look up to, because it has been an EU member state since 2004. It's at this point quite well integrated. And one thing that we could see in recent years, because initially there has been this detachment from Slovenia from the rest of the former Yugoslav lands, and Slovenia considered itself to be more in the Central European geographical and political region. But if you think about Slovenia nowadays, there are more initiatives towards the Western Balkans. So I think that overall we can think of the role of Slovenia as stabilizing, but I guess that this is something to be seen in the future, and also will depend on the different government configurations in the country. And to Alessandra's question on scenarios and whether I could forecast the future for the region. So now to be honest, since I'm still a citizen of Montenegro, of a country in the Western Balkans, meaning that I'm not an EU citizen. So I'd like to close my eyes and say within 5 to 10 years, I'll be a European Union citizen, which also comes with quite a lot of nice things. But if I'm to be realistic, within the next 5 to 10 years, within the next 5, I don't see the region becoming, any of the region's countries getting into the European Union. Within the next 10, I doubt it, unless someone, I don't know, unless someone decides to admit one of them to say, look, enlargement is not dead. I also hope, but this is something that that will depend on quite a lot of factors and also on the development of the situation in Ukraine. I hope that there will not be conflicts and that the region will stabilize and then slowly start moving ahead instead of backwards. But these are all hopes and dreams, and let's hope that some of them turn into a nice scenario. So, or at least not a bleak one.
Thank you so much, Jelena. I think you are the most optimistic Eastern European, West-East European that I've ever met. And thank you all for your questions. And this has been quite a tour de force. So you get more during the aperitivo than anyone else. This has been a very, very good conversation for us. And I think you've given us a lot of food for thought and also a lot of content that we will be going through during our classes as well. Now if you could just put your hands together and help me thank Jelena for what you're trying to purchase. And guys, deeper events, you know where they take place, and watch the website, and we're gonna keep doing these things for the rest of the semester. So thanks a lot for coming.